I stood in the middle of a burning hayrick, the orange glow of the fire dancing off the polished silver of a Lexus parked just across my fence. The smoke was thick enough to choke the life out of a man, but through the haze, I could see Morgan Pearson. She wasn't holding a fire extinguisher. She was holding a smartphone, a cold, triumphant smile on her face as she watched 80 years of my family's history go up in sparks. She didn't just want my land for a pickleball court. She wanted to bury me in the ash so she could pave over the evidence of her own crimes. They say you can't fight City Hall, but they never said anything about a homeowners association run by a woman who treats a suburban expansion like a holy crusade. This isn't just a story about a tractor being stolen in the dead of night or a creek being illegally dammed to feed a decorative pond. It's about what happens when a man with nothing left to lose but the dirt under his fingernails decides to stop being a neighbor and starts being a problem. If you've ever felt the walls closing in or seen a bully hide behind a clipboard, pull up a chair. I'm going to show you exactly how I took my gavel back. Today's story is from James, a man who measures time and seasons in soil rather than fiscal quarters and board meetings. He is a man made of weathered cedar and 80s diesel grit, driven not by a desire for conflict, but by a quiet, bone-deep duty to protect the only patch of earth that still remembers his father's name. Before we dive in, please do me a favor and smash that like button now, and comment below on what you would have done if you were in James's situation. The sun was a dull copper penny hanging over the ridge, baking the scent of dry earth and diesel into the air. I was hip deep in the guts of my '84 John Deere, my hands slick with a cocktail of hydraulic fluid and old-fashioned grit. To anyone else, it was just a hunk of green iron and rust. But to me, it was the heartbeat of 80 acres. I wiped a streak of grease across my forehead, looking out over the north pasture. It wasn't a lawn. It was a rolling sea of orchard grass and clover, dotted with the occasional stubborn thistle. To the west, the old barn stood like a gray weathered cathedral, its cedar shingles curling at the edges like dried tobacco leaves. Inside, 50 head of cattle were starting to low for their evening feed, a sound that usually settled my soul. But today, the silence was broken by something that didn't belong, the high-pitched whir of an electric window. I pulled my head out of the tractor's manifold and squinted. Across the fence line, a line I'd staked myself with hand-hewn cedar posts. The world changed. On my side, there was the chaotic beauty of a working farm, the smell of manure, the clucking of red star hens, and the rhythmic thud-thud of a loose shutter on the tool shed. On her side, it was Meadowview Estates, a grid of eggshell and toasted almond houses that looked like they'd been dropped from a plane by someone who hated trees. Morgan Pearson was leaning against my fence post. She was wearing a white pantsuit that looked like it had never seen a speck of dust, and her blonde bob was so sharp you could have used it to level a foundation. "Mr. Reed? James? Are you quite finished playing in the dirt?" Her voice had that practiced, customer service sweetness that usually preceded a knife in the back. I stood up, my knees popping like gravel under a tire, and tossed my oily rag onto the tractor's fender. "It's a farm, Morgan," I said, my voice gravelly from lack of use. "Dirt is the primary ingredient. It's a dust bowl, James, and frankly, it's becoming a liability for the Phase 4 residents." She gestured with a manicured hand toward a row of identical colonials. "I have the blueprints in the Lexus. The HOA board has already cleared the funding. We're expanding the leisure corridor. We need your north pasture for the Olympic-sized pool and the pickleball complex. It's what the modern homeowner demands." I walked over to the fence, taking my time. I'm 6'2" and mostly made of ropey muscle and stubbornness. I smelled like hard work. She smelled like expensive lilies and atmospheric spite. "I don't care what the modern homeowner demands," I said, leaning my elbows on the cedar. "This land has been in the Reed family since the steam engine was high-tech. My grandfather broke his back clearing those stones. My father kept it going through the '80s when every other farm in the county went under." I looked back at the barn. I could see the patch on the roof I'd fixed after the blizzard of '14, and the height marks scratched into the doorframe where I'd grown up. "Everything has a shelf life, James," Morgan said, her smile not even bothering to reach her eyes. She pulled a crisp, cream-colored envelope from her pocket. "This offer is 3 times the market value. You could buy a condo in the city. You could have a lawn that someone else mows. You could finally stop smelling like whatever that is." "That's the smell of a mortgage that's been paid off for 20 years, I countered. "I don't want a condo. I like the rust on my tractor, And I like the fact that I can pee off my back porch without hitting a neighbor's gazebo. The mask slipped then, just a fraction. Her eyes narrowed, turning into two cold flints. You're being sentimental, and sentiment is a luxury you can't afford. Look at your fence, James. It's sagging. Look at your barn. It needs $10,000 in paint alone. You're a relic in a gated community, and the board doesn't like relics. Then tell the board to stop looking over the fence, I said, stepping back from the wire. The answer is no. Not today. Not when the developers come back tomorrow. And not when you're 60 and still trying to find a manager who will tolerate that haircut. Morgan didn't flinch. She just gripped the envelope tight enough to crinkle the paper. She turned on her heel, a sensible, expensive heel that had no business being on a dirt road, and marched toward her silver SUV. We aren't going away, James, she called over her shoulder, her voice echoing off the side of my barn. You'll find that living next to Meadowview is about to become very, very expensive for you. The SUV door slammed with a muffled high-end thud. As she peeled away, kicking up a cloud of my dust onto her pristine paint job, I looked down at my hands. They were shaking, just a little, not from fear, but from the realization that the coyotes weren't the most dangerous things prowling the perimeter anymore. I walked back to the John Deere, picked up the wrench, and got back to work. I had a farm to run, and apparently, a war to win. The orange slip of paper sat on my scarred oak kitchen table, looking like a neon wound against the wood. Notice of violation, it screamed in bold, blocky letters. I didn't need to read the fine print to know whose name was written between the lines in invisible ink. I spent the next 6 hours under a sun that felt like a physical weight, shoveling 5 tons of black gold. My compost pile, a carefully managed mountain of manure and straw that would have nourished my heirloom tomatoes come spring, had to move. According to the newly amended county ordinance, it was 20 feet too close to the Meadowview property line. Every shovelful was a reminder of Morgan's reach. She wasn't just the president of a homeowners association. She was a donor to the county commissioner's re-election campaign. She knew which bureaucratic levers to pull to make a man's life miserable 1 yard at a time. My back screamed, a dull, throbbing ache that radiated from my lumbar to my jaw. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Giving her a reason to slap a lien on the property was exactly what she wanted. By the time the sun began to dip, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley, I was finished. I leaned on my shovel, wiping a cocktail of sweat and grit from my eyes. Across the fence, on a perfectly manicured berm that had been graded to keep my filth out of their sight, I saw a flash of white. Morgan was there. She wasn't hiding. She stood on the crest of the hill with a pair of binoculars around her neck, looking like a general surveying a battlefield. She didn't wave. She didn't even acknowledge the man who'd just spent his Saturday moving a mountain of dung. She just tapped something into her phone, likely a progress report to her board, and turned back toward her patio, her white pantsuit still impossibly pristine. I retreated to my porch, the floorboards groaning a familiar welcome. I cracked a cold beer, the condensation stinging my blistered palms, and watched the estates wake up for the evening. Their lights flickered on in a synchronized hum, expensive, warm-spectrum LEDs that mimicked a sunset but lacked the soul of one. They looked like a string of pearls slowly strangling the throat of the valley. The silence of the evening was shattered by the grinding gears of a heavy commercial engine. A flatbed truck, loaded high with rolls of premium sod and a dozen towering Leyland cypresses, idled at the HOA gate. A crew in matching lime green vests began unloading. They weren't just landscaping. They were planting a living wall right along our shared border. In 3 years, those trees would hit 30 feet, casting a permanent cold shadow over my best north-facing growing soil. It was a strategic strike designed to kill my yield before I even planted a seed. Fine, I whispered into the neck of my bottle. You want to play with maps and ordinances, Morgan? Let's look at the fine print. I went inside and pulled a heavy, rolled-up topographical map from the bottom of the sideboard. It was dated 1954, hand-drawn and smelling of old dust and cedar. I cleared the dinner plates and spread it out, pinning the corners down with a salt shaker and a heavy glass ashtray. I traced the line of the seasonal creek that ran through the back of my woods and disappeared under the HOA's scenic jogging trail. If my memory served, and it usually did when it came to water, that creek didn't just disappear. It was diverted. And in this state, diverting a natural waterway without a federal environmental impact study wasn't just a violation, it was a felony. I looked at the map, then out the window at the glowing fortress of Meadowview. Morgan Pearson thought she was David's Goliath, but she'd forgotten one thing. Goliath lived in a house made of glass, and I was sitting on a whole lot of stones. The map didn't lie, but it did tell a story that Morgan Pearson clearly wanted buried under several tons of scenic jogging trail. I spent the better part of the morning in the back 40, where the tree line thickens into a tangle of oak and wild blackberry. The old topographic map from '54 showed a clear blue line, a seasonal creek that historically fed into the lower pond on my property. But when I reached the HOA fence line, the water stopped. Not because of a drought, but because someone had played God with the landscape. Following the dry bed back toward the Meadowview perimeter, I found it. A massive, half-hidden concrete culvert. It was a professional job, tucked behind a screen of those newly planted cypresses. Morgan's expansion hadn't just added houses. It had effectively dammed a natural waterway to create a decorative pond for their Phase 4 gazebo area. I knelt by the culvert, snapping photos on my phone. In many jurisdictions, blocking or diverting a natural waterway in a way that harms a neighbor's property can lead to significant legal consequences, including civil lawsuits or even criminal charges for environmental violations. It was a strategic strike designed to kill my yield. And for a development as big as Meadowview, I was betting my last acre Morgan hadn't filed the necessary environmental impact studies. I was so focused on the culvert that I didn't hear the crunch of gravel behind me. Lost, James? Or just trespassing? I stood up, pocketing my phone. Morgan was standing on the jogging trail, 10 feet above me. She was wearing a designer tracksuit that probably cost more than my first truck, holding a leash attached to a tiny, high-strung dog. Just looking for my creek, Morgan, I said, pointing at the dry bed. Funny thing, the map says it should be right here, but it seems to have hit a concrete wall. Morgan didn't even blink. The trail was professionally engineered. If your creek dried up, perhaps you should look into your own soil management. It's not drainage, it's a diversion. And unless you've got a permit from the EPA signed in gold ink, you're sitting on a legal nightmare. For the first time, her composure cracked. A small twitch started at the corner of her perfectly lined mouth. You're out of your depth, James. Don't start a fight you can't afford to lose. I've already lost the water, I said. At this point, I've got nothing left to lose but the dirt. And I'm real good at holding on to that. I spent the rest of the day securing the farm, checking gate latches, and moving the hens into the inner coop. But as the sun went down, a strange silence settled over the farm. I went to bed with my boots by the door and a bad feeling in my gut. I woke up at 3 a.m. to a sound that made my blood run cold. The low, guttural growl of a diesel engine starting up in my yard. My tractor. By the time I reached the porch, the shed doors were swinging wide. The '84 John Deere was gone. All that was left were two deep ruts in the mud, leading straight through my wire fence and into the dark, manicured heart of Meadowview Estates. I stood on the porch, my chest heaving, as the distant rumble of the John Deere faded into the hum of the HOA streetlights. Those ruts in my field weren't just mud. They were a roadmap of an invasion. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the kitchen phone and dialed the local sheriff's department. Sheriff's office, dispatch, a voice answered, sounding bored and overworked. This is James Reed, out on the old Reed farm. Someone just stole my tractor. I watched them drive it right through my north fence into Meadowview Estates. I need an officer out here now. There was a long silence on the other end, the kind of silence that usually precedes a heavy but, Mr. Reed? The dispatcher finally said, her tone shifting from bored to patronizing. Are you sure it was stolen? We have a record of a civil dispute regarding that property line. Are you sure this isn't a repossession or a removal of abandoned equipment? Abandoned? It was in my locked shed, I shouted, the grip on the receiver turning my knuckles white. They cut my fence. That's grand larceny and trespassing. Get someone out here. I'll send a car when one becomes available, Mr. Reed. But if this is a boundary dispute, it's a civil matter. We don't get involved in HOA disagreements. The line went dead. It took 40 minutes for a cruiser to crawl up my gravel drive. Deputy Miller stepped out, a man who'd grown up 2 towns over, someone I'd bought hay from 10 years ago. He didn't look me in the eye. He kept his gaze fixed on his clipboard, his uniform crisp and smelling of laundry detergent. "James," he nodded, though it felt like a dismissal. "Miller, they're right through there," I said, pointing at the gaping hole in my wire fence. "You can see the treads. They didn't even try to hide it. That tractor is sitting somewhere in Meadowview right now." Miller walked over to the fence, nudged a broken cedar post with the toe of his boot, and sighed. "Look, James, I spoke with the Meadowview board president on the way over, Mrs. Pearson." My stomach did a slow, nauseating roll. "You spoke to the suspect before you spoke to the victim?" "She says the tractor was obstructing a designated emergency access route," Miller said, finally looking up. His eyes were flat, disinterested. "According to the new county easement maps, the ones the HOA helped fund, that shed of yours is actually sitting on a public right-of-way. They didn't steal it. They relocated a hazard." "Relocated it where?" "I stepped into his personal space, but he didn't budge. She didn't specify, but she did mention that if you want to file a formal report, you'll need to provide a certified survey proving the equipment was on your property. Until then, my hands are tied. It's a civil property dispute. So anyone can just walk onto my land, take my livelihood, and as long as they call it relocation, it's fine." "I'm just telling you what the paperwork says, James," Miller said, turning back toward his car. "And if I were you, I wouldn't go over there looking for it. That'd be criminal trespass. You don't want to make this worse." He drove away, leaving me standing in the dark with a broken fence and a silent farm. I looked toward the glowing houses of Phase 4. I could almost see Morgan sitting behind one of those darkened windows, sipping tea and watching the deputy leave. She didn't just have the money and the maps. She had the law. I walked back to the house, but I didn't go to bed. I went to the gun safe, not for a rifle, but for the heavy-duty bolt cutters I kept in the bottom drawer. If the law wouldn't help me find my tractor, I'd just have to go on a relocation mission of my own. The moon was a sliver of bone in a bruised sky, providing just enough light to see the damage, but not enough to be seen. I stood at the edge of my property, looking through the jagged gap where my fence used to be. The cedar was splintered, the wire coiled like a dead snake in the mud. Beyond the gap lay the green belt, a strip of manicured grass that separated my dirt from their toasted almond stucco. I didn't take the truck. I didn't even take the quad. If the law was going to treat me like a trespasser, I was going to be a ghost. I wore my darkest canvas jacket and carried a heavy-duty flashlight I'd taped over with red film to dull the glare. In my hand, the bolt cutters felt like a cold iron anchor. Stepping onto the HOA grass felt wrong. It was too soft, too perfect, like walking on a giant pool table. Every few yards, a motion-activated light would hiss and bathe a patch of lawn in artificial white. I stayed low, sticking to the shadow of the Leyland cypresses Morgan had planted. The irony wasn't lost on me. Her living wall was now my primary cover. I followed the deep, muddy ruts of the John Deere. They stood out like scars on a pageant queen's face. Whoever had driven it hadn't cared about the HOA's precious turf. They'd churned up the grass, leaving clods of my dark, rich farm soil scattered across their pristine emerald fescue. The tracks led toward the back of the Phase 4 development, ending abruptly at a massive, windowless structure, the HOA maintenance shed. It was built to look like a carriage house, but it was basically a bunker for lawnmowers and golf carts. The main door was locked with a heavy-duty digital keypad. I pressed my ear against the cold metal. I could hear it, the faint, metallic ticking of a cooling engine. "My engine. I see you, girl," I whispered, the anger in my chest flaring into a steady, hot coal. I didn't have the code, but the scenic jogging trail ran right behind the building, and the engineers had left a small ventilation window near the roofline to prevent fuel fumes from building up. I hauled myself up a nearby decorative trellis, the wood creaking under my weight, and peered through the grime-streaked glass. There she was, my '84 John Deere, looking like a captured king in a cell. She was parked between two shiny, electric Toro mowers that looked like toys next to her. A heavy yellow chain was looped through her rear axle and padlocked to a floorbolt. This wasn't relocation. This was a trophy. Just as I was about to climb down and look for a way in, a pair of headlights swept across the front of the shed. I froze, pressing my face into the trellis. A silver Lexus pulled up, the same one that had kicked up dust on my drive. The driver's side door opened, and Morgan Pearson stepped out. She wasn't in a pantsuit this time. She was wearing a silk robe and holding a slim tablet. A man in a Meadowview security uniform met her at the door. "Is the situation contained?" Morgan asked, her voice cutting through the night air like a razor. "Yes, Mrs. Pearson. We moved it in an hour ago. The local PD already did the drive-by. Like you said, they aren't touching a civil matter." "Good," she said, tapping something on her tablet. "Keep it locked. I want him to see it through the window every morning. I want him to feel the weight of his own stubbornness every time he looks over that fence. By the time he gets a court order to retrieve it, the north pasture will already be under 6 inches of concrete." The guard nodded. "And the hazard notice for the shed?" "Filed. The county will be out to condemn the structure by Friday. Once the shed is gone, he has no place to store the equipment anyway. He'll fold, Brian. Men like James Reed always do when they realize the world has moved on without them." She turned back to her car, her bob shimmering under the security lights. As she drove away, I stayed on that trellis, my fingers cramping into the wood. She wasn't just trying to buy the farm. She was trying to dismantle my life, brick by brick, until there was nothing left for me to stand on. She thought I was a relic. Well, the thing about relics is that they're usually made of harder stuff than the people trying to break them. I waited until the guard did his final rounds and disappeared into the clubhouse. Then, I climbed down. I didn't break in. Not yet. I had a better idea. If Morgan wanted to use the law and hazards as a weapon, I was going to give her a crash course in agricultural physics. I didn't knock on her door. That's what a man looking for an argument does. I'm a man looking for his property, and in this valley, the only thing more certain than the sunrise is that a reed doesn't let a thief sleep soundly. I spent the next 2 hours in a blur of silent, practiced motion. I went back to my side of the fence and grabbed a heavy-duty chain, a can of WD-40, and my old set of lockpicks, a skill I'd picked up from a cousin who'd spent some time in state-funded housing. The HOA maintenance shed was built for aesthetics, not for a siege. I approached from the blind spot of the security camera, creeping through a flower bed filled with pansies that smelled like expensive perfume and betrayal. The side door was a standard industrial deadbolt. It took me 3 minutes of sweating in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, before I heard the sweet, metallic clack. I slipped inside, the air thick with the scent of fresh-cut grass and the oily, familiar musk of my John Deere. Seeing her there, chained up like a stray dog, made my jaw ache. I didn't start the engine. I wasn't that stupid. I knelt in the dark, the red-filmed flashlight between my teeth, and went to work on the floor bolt. It was a heavy, 3/8-inch steel eyelet. My bolt cutters weren't going to touch it, but Morgan had made a mistake. She'd hired maintenance professionals who valued convenience over security. The floor bolt wasn't set in deep concrete. It was screwed into a heavy wooden sleeper under the floorboards. I used a crowbar to pry the board up, the wood screaming in the silence. Every groan of the timber felt like a gunshot. I froze, holding my breath, listening for the guard's footsteps. Nothing but the hum of the HOA's distant electric fence. I freed the chain, coiled it around the axle, and then looked at the two shiny green and yellow electric Toro mowers. They were the pride of the Meadowview landscaping fleet. "Fair's fair, Morgan," I whispered. "I didn't steal them. I just relocated them." I unhooked their charging cables and pushed them into the back corner of the shed, stacking a dozen bags of mulch in front of them until they were completely buried. If she wanted to play hide and seek with equipment, we'd play. Then came the hard part. I put the John Deere in neutral. Pushing 6,000 pounds of iron by hand is a young man's game. But I had leverage and a slight incline toward the door. I braced my back against the wall and pushed with my legs until my vision went blurry. Slowly, the beast groaned. Inch by inch, she rolled toward the night air. I steered her through the double doors and onto the scenic jogging trail. The rubber tires didn't make much noise on the asphalt, but I knew the clock was ticking. I pushed her all the way to the gap in my fence, my lungs burning, my shirt soaked through with sweat. Once she was back on my dirt, I climbed into the seat. I didn't start her. I just sat there in the dark, my hands on the cold steering wheel, feeling the pulse of the farm return. I looked back at the HOA. The lights were still twinkling, oblivious. Morgan was probably dreaming of blueprints and pickleball. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, laminated sign I'd printed in the house. I walked back to the HOA side of the fence and staked it right in the middle of their ruined emerald fescue tracks. Notice, unauthorized relocation of agricultural assets is subject to reclamation. Property dispute in progress. Have a nice day. I walked back to my porch, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. This was only the first skirmish. She had the law, she had the money, and she had the bobs. But she'd forgotten that a farmer spent his whole life fighting things that didn't want him to succeed. Tomorrow, the county would come for my shed. But today, the king was back in his castle. I didn't sleep long, but I slept hard. I woke up with the sunrise, my muscles feeling like they'd been tenderized with a meat mallet. The '84 John Deere was sitting exactly where I'd left her, tucked deep inside the old barn, hidden behind a mountain of hay. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was enough to keep her out of sight from any binoculars peering over the fence. I was on my second cup of coffee when the first set of tires crunched on the gravel. I didn't even have to look. I knew the sound of a government-issued Ford Taurus. Two men stepped out. One was the inspector from before, looking even more miserable in the morning light. The other was a man in a crisp navy windbreaker with county building official stenciled in gold on the back. He carried a tablet like it was a holy relic and wore a pair of sunglasses that cost more than my monthly feed bill. "James Reed?" the man in navy asked, not bothering with a handshake. "I'm Inspector Thorne. We're here to conduct a mandatory safety and compliance inspection of the hazardous structures on this property, specifically the machine shed." "The shed's been standing for 60 years, Thorne," I said, leaning against the porch railing. "Suddenly it's a hazard?" "A formal complaint was lodged by the neighboring development," Thorne said, his voice flat. "Buildings that are structurally unsound or pose a risk to public safety are subject to immediate condemnation. If this shed is on a public right-of-way, as the new maps suggest, the county has the authority to order its removal within 48 hours. I watched them walk toward the shed. The one Morgan had claimed was on an emergency access route. I followed at a distance, my heart thumping. I knew the shed was sturdy, but I also knew how easy it was to find a violation when someone was paying you to look for one. Thorne spent 20 minutes poking at the cedar post with a screwdriver and taking photos of the roofline. He didn't look happy. Every time he tried to find a rot spot, the screwdriver just bounced off the seasoned wood. "It's sound," I said, crossing my arms. "Grandfather built it to last a century." Thorne didn't answer. He was staring at the ground, specifically at the heavy wooden sleeper I'd pried up the night before to free my tractor. "This floorboard is loose," he noted, tapping it with his boot. "Structural instability. And where is the machinery that was supposed to be stored here?" Mrs. Pearson's report mentioned a large, obstructing vehicle that needed relocation. "I moved it," I said simply. "Hazard mitigated." Thorne looked at me over the top of his sunglasses. "You moved a 6,000-pound tractor by yourself in the middle of the night? Without a trailer?" "I'm a farmer, Thorne. I'm resourceful." Before he could respond, a silver Lexus pulled up to the HOA fence line. Morgan didn't get out this time. She just rolled down the window, her blonde bob perfectly still, even in the morning breeze. She looked at the empty shed, then at me. For a split second, I saw it. The flash of pure, unadulterated fury behind her eyes. She knew. She knew I'd been in her shed. She knew her electric mowers were currently buried under a ton of mulch. "Inspector," she called out, her voice tight with forced professional concern. "Did you find the structural failures we discussed? The ones that make the shed an imminent threat to our jogging trail?" Thorne sighed, looking between the pristine woman in the Lexus and the grease-stained man standing in the mud. "The shed is borderline, Mrs. Pearson. But the obstruction has been removed. Without the equipment inside, it's hard to justify an immediate condemnation order." "Then find another way," Morgan snapped, the mask finally slipping. "That shed is on a right-of-way. The maps don't lie." "The maps might not," I said, stepping toward the fence. "But the water sure does. Hey, Thorne, while you're here for safety inspections, you might want to take a walk down to the back 40. I've got a diversion of a natural waterway that's causing a real safety hazard for my livestock. Pretty sure it's a felony violation of the Environmental Protection Act." The color drained from Morgan's face so fast, it was like someone had pulled a plug. Thorne's ears perked up. "A waterway diversion? That's a different department. But if it's on the boundary, I'm required to note it." Morgan didn't wait for him to finish. She rolled up the window and peeled away, her tires shrieking on the asphalt. I looked at Thorne, who was already scribbling in his tablet. "Guess we're going for a walk," I said. The environmental inspector, a woman named Sarah with a no-nonsense ponytail and mud-caked boots, spent 3 hours trekking through my backwoods. She didn't care about visual blight or bobs. She cared about flow rates and riparian zones. It's a textbook diversion, she said, kneeling by the dry creek bed where it hit the HOA's concrete culvert. They've effectively choked off a seasonal tributary to feed that decorative pond up by their clubhouse. Without a Section 404 permit, this is a massive Clean Water Act violation. I leaned against a white oak, watching her take water samples from the stagnant pool on the HOA side. What's the fallout for something like that? Fines. Big ones, she said, clicking her pen. Daily penalties until it's restored. And the HOA board, specifically the officers who signed off on the landscaping improvements, could be held personally liable if they knowingly bypass the environmental impact study. That word, personally, stuck in my head like a burr in a sheep's wool. When the inspectors finally left, I didn't go back to the tractor. I went to my office, a corner of the kitchen cluttered with seed catalogs and tax returns. I pulled out a folder I'd been keeping for months, ever since the first offer to purchase had arrived. I started digging into the public filings for Meadowview Estates. Most of it was standard bureaucratic fluff, but then I found the annual capital improvement budget. Last year, the HOA had supposedly spent $200,000 on subsurface drainage and soil stabilization for the north perimeter. I looked out my window at the dry creek. $200,000? That culvert was a 3-day job with a backhoe and a couple of concrete pipes. Maybe 50 grand, tops. I spent the next 4 hours cross-referencing the contractors listed in the HOA minutes. Most were legitimate, but one name kept popping up. Pearson Developments and Logistics. I felt a cold grin spread across my face. Morgan wasn't just the president of the HOA. She was the contractor. She was hiring herself to fix problems she'd created, using the homeowner's dues to line her own pockets. And she needed my farm, not for a pickleball court, but to bury the evidence of her soil stabilization project before an independent auditor could see the books. The expansion wasn't a growth plan. It was a shell game. If she annexed my land, she could roll the costs of the new construction into the old debt and hide the missing funds forever. I was so deep in the spreadsheets that I almost missed the sound of a stone hitting my porch. Then another. Clack. Clack. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. Standing at the edge of the shadows was a man I recognized, one of the Phase 4 residents, a guy named Miller who I'd seen walking a golden retriever. He looked terrified. "Mr. Reed?" he whispered, glancing back at the glowing streetlights of the HOA. "I'm on the finance committee. Or I was, until Morgan had me removed last night." "Why'd she remove you, Miller?" "I asked to see the receipts for the North Pasture drainage," he said, stepping into the dim light of my porch. "She told me the files were digitally corrupted, but I managed to save a backup of the ledger before she locked me out of the server." He held out a thumb drive, his hand shaking. "She's not just trying to take your farm, James. She's already spent the money for it. If she doesn't get your deed by the end of the month, the bank is going to realize the HOA's reserve fund is empty." I took the drive, the plastic feeling heavy in my palm. The David versus Goliath fight had just changed. Goliath wasn't just a bully. She was a thief, and she was running out of time. The thumb drive felt like a live wire in my pocket. Miller vanished into the darkness of the greenbelt as quickly as he'd appeared, leaving me alone with the digital ghost of Morgan's crimes. I didn't plug it into my computer right away. I sat on the porch, watching the perimeter. If Morgan was as desperate as Miller said, she wouldn't be waiting for the county to file paperwork anymore. She was playing for her life. Around midnight, the sabotage graduated from bureaucratic to physical. I heard the high-pitched snap of a wire under tension. Then another. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a fallen branch. It was the sound of my south pasture fence being cut. Not just a hole, but a systematic destruction. I grabbed my heavy-duty spotlight and ran toward the sound. The beam cut through the dark, reflecting off the eyes of my Hereford cattle. They were restless, huddling near the break. Beyond them, a figure in a dark hoodie was methodically snipping the high-tensile wire with industrial shears. "Hey!" I bellowed, my voice echoing off the valley walls. The figure didn't run. They turned, the spotlight catching the glint of a silver watch. Expensive, slim, and feminine. It was Morgan. She wasn't sending a goon this time. She was doing the dirty work herself, her face a mask of cold, calculated rage. "You're trespassing, Morgan!" I shouted, closing the distance. and that's criminal damage to property. She dropped the shears into the tall grass and stood her ground. Your cattle are a public nuisance, James. If they accidentally wander onto the HOA golf course tonight, the county will have no choice but to impound them as a safety risk. Imagine the boarding fees for 50 head of cattle. You'll be bankrupt by Tuesday. You're losing it, I said, stopping 10 feet away. Cutting fences in the middle of the night? That's not a board president. That's a desperate woman trying to hide a $200,000 hole in her books. The silence that followed was heavy. The only sound was the rhythmic clink of a cow's bell. Morgan's breathing was shallow, her eyes darting to the pocket where I held the thumb drive. I don't know what Miller told you, she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss. But a disgruntled ex-member's word against mine won't hold up in court. I have the papers. I have the support. You're just a man with a dying farm. I'm a man with a ledger, I countered. I know about Pearson Developments. I know you've been billing the HOA for work you never did. And I know you need my north pasture to cover the tracks of your soil stabilization fraud. Morgan took a step toward me, her shadow stretching long and jagged over the broken fence. Even if you have the files, who's going to listen? The sheriff? The county board? I built this community. I am the community. You're just the dirt they have to drive past to get home. She turned and walked back toward the HOA, leaving the fence gaping open. She didn't run. She didn't look back. It was a dare. She wanted the cattle to get out. She wanted the chaos. I spent the next 3 hours in the dark, using every spare inch of wire and twine I had to patch the fence. My hands were shredded, my back was screaming, but I didn't let a single cow cross that line. As the sun began to peek over the ridge, I didn't go to bed. I went to the phone and made 3 calls. Not to the police, and not to the county. I called the 3 other members of the HOA Finance Committee that Miller had mentioned. "This is James Reed," I said when the first one answered. "I think you'd like to see what's actually buried under your scenic jogging trail. Meet me at the property line in an hour. Bring your accountants." The David versus Goliath fight was moving off the field and into the boardroom, and I was bringing the stones. The dew was still thick on the orchard grass, soaking through my boots as I stood by the patched fence. I'd set up a makeshift table, 2 sawhorses and a piece of weathered plywood, right on the boundary. On my side, the smell of damp earth and manure. On theirs, the chemical scent of Lawn Master 5000. I didn't have to wait long. 3 figures emerged from the morning mist of the Meadowview jogging trail. They looked like they'd been dressed by the same department store. Sensible fleece vests, expensive khakis, and expressions of deep, suburban anxiety. Miller was in the lead, looking like he hadn't slept in a week. Behind him were Sarah Jenkins, a retired auditor who took her garden club very seriously, and David Chin, a software engineer who'd moved in 6 months ago and was already tired of Morgan's aesthetic violation emails. "Mr. Reed," Sarah said, her voice crisp, "Miller says you have the physical evidence to back up these ledger discrepancies." "I have the ledger," I said, tapping the thumb drive on the plywood. "But more importantly, I have the hole in the ground where your money went." I led them down the slope, past the grazing Herefords, to the back 40. I pointed at the dry creek bed and the massive, illegal concrete culvert. The HOA paid Pearson Developments $200,000 for subsurface drainage and soil stabilization right here, I said, gesturing to the concrete. "I've been a farmer my whole life. I've dug more trenches than Morgan's had manicures. That's 50 grand of work tops. The rest? It didn't go into the dirt. It went into her pockets." David Chin knelt by the culvert, adjusting his glasses. "The serial numbers on these precast pipes, they're from a surplus auction. I recognize the markings. They're grade B rejects." "She billed you for grade A," Miller whispered. "And she didn't just overcharge. Look at the ledger on the drive, Sarah. She's been borrowing from the roofing reserve to pay the interest on the development loans for Phase 5. Loans for land she hasn't even bought yet." Sarah Jenkins took the drive, her eyes narrowing. "If the reserve is empty, and the bank calls the note on the Phase 5 development, the HOA goes into receivership," I finished. "Your property values tank, your dues triple to cover the debt, and Morgan walks away with a contractor fee that's already been laundered through her shell company." The silence that followed was heavy. Across the fence, the automatic sprinklers hissed to life, a rhythmic reminder of the perfect life they were paying for. "She told us you were the problem, James," Sarah said, looking at my rusted tractor in the distance. She said you were a hostile neighbor holding back the prosperity of the community. I'm just a man who likes his fence line where it is, I said. But Morgan? She's a woman who needs my north pasture to hide a crime scene. If she annexes this land, she can claim the stabilization costs were part of the new construction. The paper trail disappears under the pool and the pickleball courts. We need a full audit, David said, his voice gaining strength. But she controls the server. She's blocked our access. Then don't use the server, I said. Use the bylaws. You're the finance committee. You have the right to call an emergency meeting if you suspect fiduciary negligence. You do it tonight at the clubhouse. Don't tell her until the gavel drops. She'll fight, Miller said, looking toward Morgan's house. She's got the security team on her payroll. She's got the guards, I said, a slow grin spreading across my face. But I've got the evidence. And I think it's time the Phase 4 residents learned exactly what they're actually paying for. As they turned to head back, Sarah stopped. She looked at my patched fence, the wire twisted and scarred. She did this, didn't she? The fence? She did, I said. But a reed fence is like a reed secret. It takes a lot more than a pair of shears to break it. The shadow board hurried back into the mist, their fleeces vanishing into the toasted almond horizon. I went back to the barn, but I didn't work. I sat in the seat of the John Deere watching the HOA. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for the fox to realize she was the one being hunted. The air was heavy, the kind of stillness that comes before a tornado rips the roof off a barn. I spent the afternoon checking the perimeter, my gut twisting. Morgan wasn't the type to wait for a gavel to fall. She was a cornered animal now, and cornered animals don't follow Robert's rules of order. I moved the cattle to the high timber, well away from the HOA fence. If she tried to cut the wire again, they'd be too far for her to bait. I parked the John Deere inside the old stone smokehouse, the only building on the property with a reinforced iron door and a lock that didn't care about county easements. Around 6 p.m., the first sign of the storm hit. Not rain, but fire. A thick, acrid plume of black smoke began billowing from the north pasture, right where the expansion was supposed to start. I ran toward the ridge, my heart hammering. My old Hayricks, 3 tons of dry winter feed, was an inferno. The orange flames licked at the sky, casting dancing, demonic shadows against the Meadowview cypresses. You witch, I breathed, grabbing the shovel I kept in the truck bed. I didn't have a hydrant. I didn't have a crew. I spent an hour beating at the edges of the grass, throwing dirt onto the creeping embers to keep the fire from reaching the timberline. My lungs burned, and my skin felt like it was peeling. Through the haze of smoke and heat, I saw her. Morgan was standing on the jogging trail, silhouetted against the glow of the fire. She wasn't holding shears this time. She was holding a phone, her face illuminated by the screen. She looked like she was conducting an orchestra. 5 minutes later, the siren started. But it wasn't the fire department. It was 2 county cruisers and an ambulance, followed closely by a black SUV. I recognized as the Meadowview security detail. They pulled right up to the gap in my fence. "Mr. Reed, drop the shovel." Deputy Miller's voice boomed over a loudspeaker. I stood there, covered in soot, my shirt singed, looking like a madman in the middle of a burning field. "She said it!" I shouted, pointing toward the trail. "She fired the hay!" Miller stepped out of the car, his hand on his holster. He didn't look at the fire. He looked at me. "We received a call from Mrs. Pearson reporting a controlled burn out of control. She claims you've been unstable since the equipment relocation. Given the imminent threat to residential property, the county has issued an emergency mental health evaluation order." A what? I took a step back, the shovel still in my hand. "She burned my winter feed to get me off the land for the night. The board meeting is in an hour." "Drop the shovel, James," Miller said, his voice dropping to a low, pained warning. "Don't make this a resisting arrest charge. Just come with us for the evaluation. We'll get the fire out." The security SUV doors opened, and 2 of Morgan's hired goons stepped out, wearing tactical vests. They weren't there to help the police. They were there to make sure I didn't reach the clubhouse. I looked at Morgan. She blew a stray strand of her bob out of her eyes and gave me a tiny, triumphant nod. She'd won. If I was in a 72-hour hold, she'd have the meeting canceled, the hazardous buildings demolished, and the papers signed before I could even call a lawyer. I looked at the fire, then at the deputy, then at the dark, silent woods behind me. "I'm not going in that car, Miller," I said, my voice steady. James, don't. I didn't run toward them. I ran toward the smoke. I dove into the thickest part of the haze, where the heat was a wall and the visibility was zero. I knew this land. Every dip, every hidden badger hole, every seasonal wash. They had flashlights and cruisers. I had the dirt. I vanished into the tree line, the sound of Miller's shouts fading behind the crackle of the flames. I wasn't running away. I was taking the long way around. The clubhouse was 2 miles through the brush. I had 50 minutes to get there, covered in soot and smelling like a disaster, to tell a room full of suburbanites that their queen was a firebug. I didn't take the roads. I moved through the deep woods, my lungs burning with every breath of soot-choked air. I knew the back way into the Meadowview Estates clubhouse, a service path used by the pool cleaners that bypassed the main security gate. My face was streaked with charcoal, my flannel shirt was singed at the cuffs, and my knuckles were raw from scrambling over the limestone ridge. I looked like a ghost rising from a battlefield, but my mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. The clubhouse was a sprawling, faux Tuscan monstrosity of stucco and wrought iron. Tonight, it was lit up like a Christmas tree. I could see the silhouettes of the Phase 4 residents through the floor-to-ceiling windows, huddled in the grand ballroom. I checked my watch. 7:05 p.m. The meeting had started. I slipped through the side kitchen entrance, startling a catering assistant who was plating miniature quiches. She opened her mouth to scream, but I put a finger to my soot-stained lips. "Just a neighbor checking the plumbing," I whispered. I pushed through the heavy oak double doors at the back of the ballroom. The air conditioning hit me like a block of ice, a sharp contrast to the heat of the fire still smoldering on my ridge. At the front of the room, on a raised dais, sat Morgan Pearson. She looked magnificent, not a hair out of place, wearing a navy blue blazer that screamed authority. She was mid-sentence, her voice amplified by a sleek silver microphone. And due to the tragic, unstable behavior of our neighbor, Mr. Reed, the county has declared an emergency. For the safety of our children and our property values, the board is moving for an immediate emergency annexation of the north perimeter. The only thing unstable in this room, Morgan, is your bookkeeping. My voice didn't need a microphone. It cracked across the silent room like a rifle shot. Every head turned. 100 sets of eyes, belonging to people who'd complained about my odor and my dust, now stared at me in horror. I was a vision of the very blight they feared, standing in the middle of their Turkish rug. Morgan's grip on the gavel tightened until her knuckles turned the color of her blazer. "Security! Get this man out of here. He's a trespasser and under a mental health hold." Two of the security goons in tactical vests started toward me from the wings. "Stay back." Miller, the finance committee member, stood up from the front row. "He's my guest. And according to Article 4, Section 3 of the HOA bylaws, a guest may be heard if they possess information pertinent to a fiduciary audit." The guards hesitated, looking at Morgan, then at the room full of their employers. I walked down the center aisle, my boots leaving gray ash prints on the carpet. I reached the dice and tossed the thumb drive onto the table in front of Morgan. It skittered across the polished wood and hit her water glass with a sharp clink. "That's the ledger, Morgan," I said, leaning in so the front row could hear every word. "The one that shows you've been billing these people for soil stabilization that never happened. The one that shows Pearson Developments is just a bucket with a hole in the bottom." "It's a fabrication," Morgan hissed, her face finally losing its composure. "He's a farmer. He doesn't know a balance sheet from a bale of hay." "I know what a fire looks like," I said, stepping even closer. "I know you stood on that trail and watched my winter feed burn so you could have me hauled away before this meeting." But the wind shifted, Morgan. The smoke didn't just go into my lungs. It went into the Environmental Protection Agency report that Sarah Jenkins is filing tomorrow morning. Sarah Jenkins stood up in the third row, holding a stack of papers. "We've already called the bank, Morgan. The reserve fund is empty. We're calling for a vote of no confidence and an immediate removal from the board." The room erupted. It wasn't a polite suburban debate anymore. It was a riot in khakis. People were shouting about their dues, their property values, and the living wall that was suddenly looking like a prison fence. Morgan looked around the room, her eyes darting like a trapped fox. She grabbed the gavel and slammed it down. Once, twice, 3 times. "Meeting adjourned. This is illegal. I am the president." "Not anymore," I said, reaching out and gently taking the gavel from her hand. It felt light, too light to hold back the weight of the truth. The king is back in his castle, Morgan, and it looks like you're the one who's out of a home. The silence that followed the collapse of the meeting was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a snowfall. It was the heavy, ringing stillness that comes after a structure fire. I stood on my porch 2 weeks later, nursing a mug of coffee that was mostly mud. The north pasture was a blackened scar, but the first green shoots of winter rye were already pushing through the soot. Ash makes for a hell of a fertilizer if you've got the patience for it. Across the fence, the toasted almond empire was in mourning. Morgan Pearson hadn't gone quietly, but she had gone. The county sheriff, a different one this time, one who didn't owe her any favors, had escorted her from the clubhouse that night after Sarah Jenkins presented the fiduciary audit. Turns out, when you move HOA funds into a personal shell company, it's not a civil matter anymore. It's wire fraud. The silver Lexus was gone, replaced by a for sale sign in her driveway that someone had already peppered with eggs. The scenic jogging trail was cordoned off with yellow tape. The EPA had ordered the immediate restoration of the waterway, and the HOA was footed with a daily fine until my creek started flowing again. I heard the familiar, rhythmic clank-clank of a gate latch. I didn't reach for my shovel. I just watched as Miller and David Chin walked across the greenbelt and stopped at my patched fence. They weren't wearing fleece vests today. They looked tired, like men who'd spent a fortnight reading fine print and shouting at lawyers. "Mr. Reed," Miller nodded. He looked at the blackened field, then at the '84 John Deere parked proudly in the sun. "The new board met last night. We've officially rescinded the expansion plan. The north perimeter is yours, permanently." "And the hazardous shed?" I asked, a ghost of a smile tugging at my mouth. "Zoning board dropped it," David said, leaning against a cedar post. "Turns out the emergency access route was drawn on a napkin by Morgan's brother-in-law. It doesn't exist on the official county records." He reached over the wire and handed me a small, wrapped bundle. I opened it to find a heavy brass plaque. It didn't have any HOA logos on it. It just said, "Reed Farm, EST 1924. No trespassing." "We're putting up a permanent stone monument at the property line," Sarah Jenkins called out, joining them from the trail, "to remind future boards that the fence stays where it is." I looked at the three of them, the Goliaths, who turned out to be just a bunch of folks who wanted a quiet place to live, same as me. "I appreciate it," I said. "And tell the garden club they can have as many eggs as they want, long as they don't mind a little dirt on the shells." They laughed, a genuine sound that drifted over the pasture and into the trees. As they walked back to their world of manicured lawns and master plans, I walked down to the creek bed. A tiny, silver trickle of water was pushing through the mud. It wasn't much yet, just a whisper of what it used to be. But it was moving. It was crossing the line, heading home. I climbed up onto the seat of the John Deere and turned the key. The engine roared to life, a deep, guttural growl that shook the very ground Morgan had tried to pave over. I put it in gear and headed toward the black earth, ready to turn the soot into something that could grow. The Reed farm was still 80 acres, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like the biggest piece of land in the world. And that's James's story. And if he made it this far, I'd appreciate you dropping a like and maybe throw in a comment to let me know what other HOA stories you'd like to hear. Hope that you have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you all next time.